My mom used to play that old song. I don't remember which big band or which entertainer authored it, but don't get around much anymore. I don't do too much of this anymore. I turned down an awful lot of opportunities to, I forswore anything even remotely political 6 years ago upon accepting this job. And I'm very, very cautious out of respect for the university that I serve, the broad tax-paying public that supports it, and the variety of views on our own campus and around our state. I'm very selective about saying yes to evenings like this. But I felt a very strong tug to be here and to make an exception because this cause and the people involved in it, I believe, are among the most admirable and important in our society today. And I did feel compelled to come and spend this evening with you and tell you how much I admire you, especially at this point in the trajectory of what I hope will be a highly successful education reform movement in your state. I could not resist really the chance to spend an evening in the company of selfless people, idealistic people, people who put children before the interests of children before that of adults, people who put the future ahead of the present and immediate gratification, people who are willing to stand up for ordinary citizens against powerful special interests, in fact, one of the most powerful and entrenched that we know. Henry Kissinger once said that the best thing about becoming better known was when you bore people, they think it's their fault. I'm going to try not to bore anybody tonight. And I hope I can succeed in that because this topic we're gathered about is I believe, central to not only better public policy in our country, but to our definition of who we are as a people and what we consider fair and right and appropriate. I was planning to use the word, and then I heard it in the video, uphill. I've done a little homework before coming. I've talked to Laura and her colleagues, wanted to make sure I understood the state of play here. And I think it's fair to say, although you've had some breakthroughs recently and some improvements, you are looking uphill. All the big things you might hope to see happen in your state in terms of better education for children in the public schools, children in general, are yet to be accomplished. And I want to tell you that I know what uphill looks like. And there was a long, long time when I assumed I would move on through my active years and still be looking uphill. And so I want to bring you mainly words of encouragement. I have to bring you words of caution and warning along with them, but I hope you will receive them as secondary to a more optimistic note I hope to leave. I've got a clipping somewhere I just loved from some small southern Indiana newspaper many years ago now, reported on the funeral of a local worthy. And the article in the account of that event said that when they got to the cemetery, one of the casket bearers stepped in a hole and broke his ankle. The article said it cast a pall over the whole occasion. So I don't want to cast any palls tonight. I hope the burden, the balance, the overall impression that I leave you is one that will embolden you to press on with the tremendously important work you're engaged in here. A quick account of how Indiana finally climbed its hill, or at least climbed a long, long way. It has been a long march. I remember in my business years, which is the longest stretch I've spent doing anything, at one point in the early 90s, we assembled a pantheon of the business leadership of Indiana, all around a very specifically hammered out program of reform, and you would recognize its elements all these years later. It had accountability and quality and rewarding performance and greater choice. And got nowhere. And I thought to myself after that, if we can get all these great companies, all their influence, all the respect they have, all their employees try to get involved, and flatten our forehead against a public decision-making system and a set of entrenched interests that the way that we did, I said, if that can't work, I'm not sure what can. Then, however, we got our chance at public life. It didn't get a lot easier, but we chiseled away. For half of the time that I served, we had a divided legislature, and that's all it took to stop most reforms, because our loyal opposition was more or less owned and operated by the public education lobby. And I don't doubt they were sincere in their beliefs, but I promise you they were impervious to arguments, facts, or even the appeals of heartsick parents who were looking for something better for their kids. We found some things to do. We could find some ways to work between the seams, things that either were unobjectionable or even were welcomed by the group. We passed a bill that made it a lot harder to drop out of Indiana schools, and then the graduation rates went up double digits within a couple of years. We passed a bill to make it much harder to sue a teacher for imposing discipline in the classroom. And I don't have to tell anybody here that if a classroom's disorderly, then nobody's learning. And yet so many of our laws and practices, for strange reasons to me, seem to almost to favor the disorderly student over the interest of everyone else in the class and the teacher. So we managed to pass that. We managed to extend full-day kindergarten, which had not been a universal practice in Indiana, to everybody. But it was all a matter of a nibble here and a nibble there. And then we had a sufficient success in the third biennial election that we had big majorities of people who were open to these ideas and people with whom I was allied, and we ran the table. We passed bills to limit collective bargaining to the matters of wages and benefits. No more running the school through the contract. We had contracts that had some almost amusing provisions in them, like who got the money from the vending machine, or who could control the temperature in the teacher's lounge. But then there were some that weren't funny at all, like principal could not come observe a teacher in the classroom without a 1-week notice. You know, I'll come back to this in a minute, but I was so naive to the way in which the interest groups around the status quo are interconnected and mutually supportive. But here's a clear example of a bill absolutely empowering principals and superintendents, but they were unwilling to support it. It would have involved disassembling the alliance, which is the Iron Alliance, which has served that complex of interest groups so well for so long. Now it is the law of Indiana that teacher gets an annual evaluation, and that those teachers whose students are provably growing and doing well academically ought to be rewarded for that. What a radical concept that is. It is the law now of our state that we have A through F rating. The new ones just came out. By the way, guess how the charter schools did compared to the traditional publics in their neighborhood. We took all the wraps off charter schools, and maybe of most direct relevance this evening, we became a state of complete school choice. We had backed into the first step. By complete school choice, I mean that every citizen in Indiana now can choose any public school for their child. They can cross district lines without any limitation. And we have charter schools now everywhere that there's an interest in having one. Very easy. They can be chartered from the state level. You don't need the cooperation, which is so often lacking, of a local school district. And of course, we have a universal voucher system, means tested, but up to the level where parents can afford it anyway. The first of those was a very interesting sequence of events on the public side. It actually came as a consequence of not of an education reform measure, but as the caboose on a very popular measure where we cut property taxes in Indiana to some of the lowest in the country and capped them forever. At 1% of the value of your house is the ceiling, 2% of your farm or rental property, 3% of your business. When we did that, the mechanism was to take certain costs off the property tax completely and pull them to the state level. And the biggest one we took was school operating costs. And the minute we did that, it became unnecessary and therefore illegal to charge a family more to come across the line to a better public school system. Now, it's always been said, from Milton Friedman on, that among its other virtues, choice introduces competition where there has been monopoly. And brother, does it happen fast. That property tax reform, as soon as people saw its implications, within weeks, billboards went up. Check out our test scores. Postcard campaigns, come to an open house, and public school districts began competing with each other on the basis of quality, as you would hope it had always been. Choice, and I've been involved in this issue for a long time, is absolutely a matter of effectiveness. Everywhere it's introduced, the schools that grow, the schools that people choose, whether they are private or charter or public, in our case, demonstrably do better by the students in them. The competition argument is true too. The other schools, choice makes other schools better where they are, even for the families who don't move. But that's not what brought me here tonight. That's not why I find this subject irresistible to talk about in a way that others are not. Because in the end, to me, it's not the practical questions that dominate, as important as they are, as valid as they are. This is the civil rights issue of our time. Vocabulary, language is so important. And it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think, who first said, "He who controls the dictionary controls the debate." And now and then we see, I see at least, words that I think are misused or distorted out of their meaning, or sometimes appropriated by people who have no entitlement to dictate their meaning. And the biggest example I know of these days is the phrase social justice, which someone has allowed to be appropriated by people who mean taking money from person A and giving it to person B, which is quite often a very appropriate and worthy public policy goal, but it's only one definition of justice. If there's any word that ought to belong to everybody and ought to be freely debated, what is the meaning of justice? The Greek philosophers spent their lives on that question. Well, whether social justice is an accurate term, a fitting term in the way it's most commonly used today. I can't think of a more socially just cause than school choice. Freeing and empowering many of the least powerful, least influential of our fellow citizens to make arguably one of the most important choices they will ever make: how to ensure a better future for their children. And so, to all those who gather anywhere around that subject, I feel enormous affinity, and for them I feel enormous admiration. You seek, I guess I'd put it this way. I think this is both the noblest and the hardest social justice cause I can think of. Noblest for many of the reasons I just gave. Noble in the sense that no one in this room, no one I've ever met on this topic was in it for themselves in any way. There's no money in it for you. There's no power in it for you. You're seeking to provide resources and decision-making power to others. Especially noble because it is so hard, because the forces arrayed around a failed monopoly are so tough. I speak here as a practitioner with the scars to show for it. The toughest, most determined, most often best funded, and most influential interest group or set of interest groups that I know of in public life. And for you to take them on, not on your own behalf, but on behalf of others, is, as I say, as noble as any cause I know. Why is it so hard? Allies like Lisa, God bless them, are transitory. It is almost impossible, and we understand why, for parents, once their own children move through the system, to stay with they've got other obligations, to stay with the cause. So your allies have to be constantly re-recruited, but your adversaries will never go away and are there and very practiced and very seasoned at what they do. They are, as I say, monolithic, united, well-practiced, well-funded, and powerfully motivated by their own self-interest. That's a tough assignment to take on. You know, I learned early on that utilize a little two-part test when I was trying to talk about the subject of education to people. And you can figure out pretty fast where somebody comes from. If they use the word, if they bring up dollars before they bring up kids, one antenna goes up for me. If they bring up the system before they bring up results, then up goes the other one, and you pretty much know who you're dealing with. And yet, to so many of them, somehow it doesn't seem strange. That's just the way they have been acculturated by now. I had so many little epiphanies along the way. As I say, I was pretty naive to some of this in the beginning. For one thing, I did not understand. I simplistically and erroneously thought that the real problem was simply the teachers' union. I thought I understood that. No, it's so much more complicated than that. As I say, the whole edifice, the principals, the superintendents, the school boards, there's just no pro-change impulse there that I've found, not in any quantities, not in any open quantities. You can find them individually. A principal who wrings his hands that he doesn't have the authority to run a school, recruit and keep the right teachers, move out the bad ones, all that sort of thing, but don't expect him to say it in public. The peer pressure, the discipline of the guild is too strong. So I'd have these little discoveries. Why aren't they, this school discipline thing, why aren't they for it? Oh, we're protecting them against harassment and helping them to just do the first job of any teacher, which is to maintain some order so kids can learn. Someone says, hey, don't you know the union sells liability insurance? They don't want to take away the need for that. You know, one of those. We made a concerted effort to pass legislation to require that more dollars go to the classroom. So as you know, depending who's doing the calculating, it's hard to find a place where more than 70 cents of the education dollar we spend actually shows up in a teacher's paycheck or in anything directly related to the arena of learning. In our state, it was closer to 60% as best we could tell. So why wouldn't they be for that? We're going to try to force money out of administration and out of nice-to-haves and into the must-have job of teaching kids. Pay teachers more, have more of them, and so forth. No, turns out, way too many teachers can't wait to get out of the classroom and become a third assistant superintendent of something or other. We got no help at all on that. I was totally perplexed. We were giving our achievement test in the fall. The kids have just gotten there. And he said, why is that? Well, someone would say, well, dummy, if you give it in the spring, it'll be perfectly clear who taught the kid that year. By the fall, the kids in, you know, Mr. Choi's class are scattered in 3 or 4 other classes. Nobody can figure out who's responsible for a bad job. We fixed that, along with these other things. We used to have school board elections in the primary, in the spring, in May. Well, why do we do that? Well, dummy, that's when the electorate is so much smaller, it's a lot easier for the interest groups to control who wins. So we fixed that. But these are lessons I learned along the way. Oh, one more. We came up with the idea, I came up with the idea, I guess. As traveling around meeting a lot of students, I kept running into students in this day and age who were accumulating dual credit for college, taking advanced placement courses, or were just hustlers who told me that they had completed their high school requirements and before their senior year was over. So I started asking classes, how many here could finish in 11 years, or going to, or could, if you wanted? A lot of hands would go up. Then I'd ask them, well, if you did that and we gave you the money we were going to spend on while you loafed around your senior year, as long as you used it for higher education, how'd that sound? Usually some kid would say, how much is it? Fair question. So we passed that. But do you think we got any help from the educators of our state? Why wouldn't they want to encourage diligent, hardworking students to move ahead as fast as possible? They'd rather keep the money and the student, whether they were really making any educational headway that year or not. So I'm sure there are scarred veterans in this room who know all this and know more about this than I do, but this is the nature of the challenge you have taken on. And yet, I implore you not to be discouraged. Breakthroughs can happen. They did for us. They have now in some other states. And ultimately, justice will prevail. I honestly believe that. Now, the last caution. Even after you have achieved your goals, or as you achieve them, no win is final. The forces of this establishment never quit. I recruited a new superintendent of public instruction for our second term, and we went right to work on things we could do administratively. He was much more reform-minded than his predecessor. We have to elect them in our state. One of only about 11 or 12 states that does that. And he became nationally known within a few years for his aggressive championing of everything I just talked about, and became a martyr to the cause. Because in 2012, very effectively, those who did not agree with what we were doing zeroed in on him and defeated him alone on a ticket of people. Parents went to Parents' Night in schools all over Indiana that fall, and instead of finding out whether little Laura was learning to read or not, they were told about this guy Bennett who was going to close the music program if he got reelected. Charges of outrageous charges of this kind. And for 4 years, until complete incompetence, visible incompetence got her defeated, he was replaced by an instrument, let's say, of the Union and their allies. And they haven't been able to repeal any of the laws, but they didn't implement them very well either. So when you break through here, as I'm sure you will, the job will not be done. So you can throw one party, but then go back to work, because you will need to defend the gains that you've made. A pro-choice, pro-reform governor got beat in Wisconsin last week. I talked to friends up there who say the legislature is firm around the programs that they have. They may not be able to get any further, but look who beat him. Someone who comes from the world that disagrees so strongly with the ideas and principles that we've just been discussing. Likewise in Michigan. And so, just as the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, likewise the price of and the ongoing cost of doing right by children in Missouri and everywhere else in this country. So, please don't be discouraged. Please believe with Lincoln at Cooper Union that right makes might and will eventually win the day. I'll just finish with a story. In that period where I had given up, I had no idea I'd wind up in a position ever to have a direct impact on things, and I told you about the frustrations and the failure of the community or private citizen reform movement I was in. And believing, as I hope you do believe, that despair is not a strategy. A few of us from a church that I belonged to since my family moved to Indiana when I was a kid. It's now an inner city because of the growth of the town church. Along with some African-American Baptists and I can't remember who else we had. We had some Lutherans in there somewhere. And anyway, we put together a little school in the toughest neighborhood of Indianapolis. I used to go around with a tin cup trying to raise money for this endeavor, and my sales tool were maps from the police department with dots where the murders occurred, where the burglaries occurred, where the drug abuse occurred, where the truancy was, and they were all clustered around this old school building which we bought from the local school board. I'll skip the intervening 20-some years and just tell you that one little candle that we thought we'd light, I said, if we can't change the system, let's create one little living embarrassment to it. There are now 2 such schools of 300 kids each, and a middle school that they now go to of 150 or 300 more, I guess. This year, again, they got the highest test scores in the state of Indiana. Higher than the suburbs, higher than... Many of you are involved at that level. There's nothing more fulfilling I'll ever do than that has been. This afternoon, just pure coincidence, a friend of mine, her name is Emerald, who was one of the early kindergartners at that school. 12 or 13 years later, she got admitted to Purdue University. And she's about to achieve her master's, probably next May. And she dropped by to proudly drop off her undergraduate research. Her first piece of research just got published, she and her professor. And she brought it to me. I have no idea what it's about. I promised to try to read it, and when I'm done, I probably won't understand what it's about. But there are a lot of emeralds out there. You're already helping so many of them. I talked to so many of you who have other projects to get to their homes and try to improve the environments from which they come. For all the harsh things I may have said about our public schools, we all know that they can't control who shows up, and they have some very tough assignments, so much tougher than schools had when most of us were that age. It's not an excuse for where things stand, but it is a reality. And so that's a wonderful corner of this whole problem to work on. But success here is essential in a humanitarian sense, the cause of justice, and in a very direct way, because so much of our future as a successful, free nation depends on it. So please persevere. Know that you have fans and friends elsewhere who will be watching and cheering and helping if we can. This is the great cause of our time, and I admire each one of you so much for your selfless commitment to it. Thank you for having me here tonight.